Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. And welcome back also to our in-depth look at pop culture in the year 1972. We're now up to the second quarter of the year, the spring and early summer, the months of April, May, and June. There's a lot to get to here, particularly a lot in music. So let's start out with the top 10 albums as the quarter began. On that first chart on April 1st, 1972, at the number one position was America's self-titled debut album in the second of what would ultimately be 5 weeks in the number one position. At number two was Neil Young's Harvest album. This had been number one for 2 weeks immediately prior to America reaching the number one spot. Hitting its number three peak was Harry Nilsson's Nilsson Schmilsson album. This would spend 3 weeks in the number three position. Hitting its number four peak was Paul Simon's self-titled album. At number five was Bread with Baby I'ma Want You. This had gone to number three the week prior. At number six was Yes with the Fragile album. This would go to number four for 2 weeks beginning April 15th. In the number seven position was Music by Carole King. This was one of two albums still in the top 10 from the beginning of the year. At its number eight peak was Al Green's Let's Stay Together album. In the number nine position was Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers Band. This would go to number four for 2 weeks beginning April 29th. And at number 10 was Don McLean's American Pie album. This was the other of the two albums that were still in the top 10 from the beginning of the year. Turning to the top 10 singles as the quarter began, sitting at number one was America, topping both the album and singles chart with its Neil Young sounding hit, A Horse with No Name, in the second of its 3 weeks in the number one position. At number two was the actual Neil Young with his hit Heart of Gold, which had hit number one on March 18th. At number three was Donny Osmond's Puppy Love, a remake of Paul Anka's number two hit from 1960. Donny's version was at its number three peak. At its number four peak was Mother and Child Reunion by Paul Simon, an early instance of a reggae song hitting the US top 10. The basic track had been recorded in Kingston, Jamaica using Jimmy Cliff's backing band. At number five was Robert John's version of The Lion Sleeps Tonight. It had been at number three for 3 weeks beginning March 11th. The song had gone to number one for the Tokens late in 1961. At number six was I Gotcha by Joe Tex. It would go to number two for 2 weeks beginning May 6th. At number seven was Without You by Harry Nilsson. It had been number one for 4 weeks beginning February 19th. Famously, the renowned songwriter's biggest hit and only number one wasn't written by him. Instead, it was a cover version of a song written by Badfinger's Pete Ham and Tom Evans and released on their 1970 album, No Dice. At number eight was Jungle Fever by Chakachas. The very cool and extremely suggestive single was at its number eight peak. It would be hard to imagine this single getting airplay even a few years earlier. Despite the Spanish lyrics and Latin sound, the group was actually from Belgium. At number nine was Michael Jackson's Rockin' Robin, a remake of Bobby Day's number two hit from 1958. Michael's version would go to number two for 2 weeks beginning April 22nd. And rounding out the top 10 was The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face by Roberta Flack. It would go to number one for 6 weeks beginning April 15th. Among top 10 singles that would come and go in the second quarter were In the Rain by the Dramatics, which would reach number five on April 22nd. The opening of that song featured wind and rain effects clearly lifted from Disney's Chilling, Thrilling Sounds of the Haunted House album from 1964. Also in the second quarter of 72, we got A Cowboy's Work Is Never Done by Sonny and Cher, which would peak at number 8 on April 29th. Betcha by Golly Wow by the Stylistics would hit number 3 on May 6th. Aretha Franklin's Daydreaming would go to number 5 on May 6th. Doctor My Eyes by Jackson Browne would go to number 8 on May 6th. Oh Girl by the Shy-Lights would hit number 1 on May 27th. Look What You've Done For Me by Al Green would hit number 4 on May 27th. Morning Has Broken by Cat Stevens would hit number 6 for 2 weeks beginning May 27th, and the Rolling Stones' Tumblin' Dice would hit number 7 for 2 weeks beginning May 27th. I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers would hit number 1 on June 3rd. Sylvia's Mother by Dr. Hook and the Medicine Show would hit number 5 for 2 weeks beginning June 3rd. Hot Rod Lincoln by Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen would go to number 9 on June 3rd. The song was first recorded by its author, Charlie Ryan, in 1955 and had gone to number 26 for Johnny Bond in 1960. Last night, I didn't get to sleep at all by the Fifth Dimension would hit number 8 for 2 weeks beginning June 17th. Also hitting the top 10 in the second quarter was Ringo Starr's second official single of his solo career, the drum-heavy and T-Rex influenced Back Off Boogaloo, which would hit number 9 for 2 weeks beginning May 13th. As it would transpire, 1972 would turn out to be a surprisingly fallow year for all 4 of the former Beatles. Paul's first album with his new band, the underwhelming Wings Wildlife, had been released late in '71 and had gone to number 10 early in the year. Apart from this, only Ringo's single would break the top 10, even the top 20 in 1972. Paul would release 3 more singles during the year, Give Ireland Back to the Irish in February, Mary Had a Little Lamb in May. These would go to number 21 and 28 respectively. It wasn't until December, when the third single, Hi Hi Hi, was released, that he would begin getting back in the groove. Another T-Rex influenced song, it would reach number 10, but not until February 3rd, 1973. Paul McCartney and Wings spent much of the year on the road, but in a very low-key manner. In February, they did the famous Hit and Run tour of British universities, turning up without warning and offering to play. In the summer, they launched the slightly more ambitious Wings Over Europe. It was still a low-key and slightly ramshackle tour designed to begin shaping the band into a tight performing unit. Nevertheless, this cautious approach was lost on some people who assumed that Paul McCartney must have fallen on hard times to be playing in these relatively out-of-the-way places rather than selling out 5 nights at Madison Square Garden. After the twin triumphs of the All Things Must Pass album in 1970 and the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971, George Harrison seems to have taken 1972 off. He didn't release anything new during the year. In fact, the only new studio material to come from George since the All Things Must Pass album was released in November 1970 was the Bangladesh single released in July 1971. The only new album from a former Beatle in 1972 was John and Yoko's Sometime in New York City album, released on June 12th. It was a double album. One album was composed of new material written by John and or Yoko. Every song was about social change or in protest or support of some specific current event, ensuring that they would rapidly become dated, just like the newspapers that inspired the artwork. Of course, folk broadside albums had operated in the same way. The problem here was that none of the songs was particularly memorable or even that good. The back cover points out that the second disc is included free of charge, which is about what it was worth. The first side, recorded at the Lyceum Ballroom in London in 1969, at least featured an okay if overlong version of Cold Turkey. The second side, from a June 1971 jam with Frank Zappa and the Mothers at the Fillmore East, quickly devolves and ends with several minutes devoted to what sounds like a vacuum cleaner with a paperclip stuck in it. The only possible use for this would be to put it on and see how rapidly people clear the room. I've played that side for a number of people over the years, usually prefacing it with, "Do you want to hear something really terrible?" John and Yoko were highly visible in 1972, lending their names and presence, if not always much of their talent, to a lot of causes and events. They'd appeared with David Peel on the U.S. David Frost show in January. In February, they joined a protest at the New York offices of British Overseas Airways and been co-hosts on the Mike Douglas show, which we discussed in an earlier episode. In April, John addressed the National Peace Rally in New York. In May, John and Yoko appeared on the Dick Cavett show and participated in anti-war demonstrations in New York. On August 30th, John performed 2 rehearsed, full-length concerts at Madison Square Garden for the benefit of the Willowbrook School for Children. Known as the one-to-one concerts, excerpts were released many years later in 1985 on the John Lennon Live in New York City album. A week later, John, Yoko, and the Elephants Memory Band made a surprise appearance on the annual Labor Day Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon. The Sometime in New York City album reached number 48 in the US. Surprisingly, it went to number 11 in the UK after it was released there in September. John and Yoko also found success with the UK release of their Happy Christmas, War Is Over single, which went to number 2 in the UK. The single had been released in the US nearly a year earlier in December 1971. Still, 1972 was a very strange year for the ex-Beatles. It seemed practically unbelievable that it had only been 8 years since they had arrived in America. Now, after some early solo successes, it seemed like a reasonable question whether any of them would be willing or able to maintain successful solo careers over the long term. We will leave it there for now because there are so many new release albums to talk about in this second quarter. I want to give those plenty of time, so we will end things here, turn it into a two-parter. Please give me your comments. If you remember those days, let me know if I'm capturing it correctly. If you don't remember those days, please let me know what you think about this. As always, I look forward to your comments. Please hit like and subscribe if you don't mind. I always appreciate that, and we will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.